what is Latin America? Well, what Latin America is the offspring, we might say, of the phallic Epimethean southern invader and the Mesoamerican or Incan recipient. Mesoamerican civilization and Incan civilization may not have been dying in the same sense that, for example, Mesopotamian civilization was dying when it was conquered, or Indus Valley civilization was dying when it was conquered. What we can say is that Mesoamerican civilization fell when Spanish conquistadors, which I'm describing more broadly as the Epimethean south of Western civilization, conquered it and did not simply destroy it and dispense with it and create a kind of settler colony of Epimethean southern Western civilization. Not at all. They very much mixed in every sense with the indigenous population of Mesoamerica and of Incan civilization. So it's a big difference with the United States. The United States, there was far less admixture. It was basically just a settler colony of the Promethean north of Western civilization, with a lot of interesting secondary ethnic influences, as you and I have talked about in previous conversations. But Latin America is Epimethean South really mixing with indigenous American or Native American, Amerindian. So it's a new thing. It's a new ethno-cultural block, certainly. It's racially distinct in that it's mestizo and mulatto. You have the Catholic sign regime, to some extent being mixed with Aztec and Incan semiotics. There's a lot of interesting literature on religious syncretism in Latin America and the way that pre-Columbian religious rituals have been mixed in with Catholicism. And as we've talked about, Mesoamerican civilization may be the ancestor worshiping civilization par excellence. That has not been shedded in Latin American culture. So this is all to say Latin America is an ethno-cultural block, but whether it is its own high civilization, I'm not sure about. I mean, maybe we could.
I have doubts about that.
Me too.
I haven't studied it thoroughly and in depth, but my suspicion is that what we're looking at actually is what Spengler terms a fellaheen, the fellaheen remains of a high civilization, namely the Mesoamerican, Olmec, Mayan, Toltec, Aztec, that civilization that's dead, done, and gone. And then laid on top of that is a thin crust of industrialization, whether we're talking about Brazil or Mexico City or whatever, this crust of industrialization. And part of the problem with this is over the last 10 years, there's been a drug war going on there, and the cartels are an external proletariat par excellence. They're totally barbaric. There's no way in which, as you know, I've tried to do with the Russians, get into their mindset and see they are a highly civilized, highly cultured, sophisticated people, and see what their motivations are. And it's a clash of civilizations there. Not so with the cartels. They're truly barbarians. They torture, murder, chop off heads, and they take great sadistic delight in doing so. Those are marks of barbarians. There's nothing civilized about them. And so they've taken over. Mexico is so weak immunologically, its Catholic immune system isn't strong enough. Its Aboriginal immune system isn't strong enough to resist them. And if that were the case, they would not have allowed themselves to be totally swallowed up by this external proletariat, which now poses a threat to the United States. I'm hearing that as a result of the Biden administration eroding the southern border, I'm hearing all kinds of terrible things going on in the Southwest, in Houston now, which used to be a very nice, respectable suburban place. They've got cartel members there having shootouts with AK-47s, machine guns. Phoenix is probably going to be uninhabitable, which is where I'm from, not a place I would ever be willing to return. So I have a feeling Biden has handed the Southwest over to the cartels, which means, judging by historical dynamics, that a very powerful ruler, president, if you want to call it that, will have to come along and make that border strong, build a kind of equivalent of the Great Wall of China, which is what civilizations in their universal state end phases, all of them have to do this. The Romans had to build the limes, the Great Wall. A bunch of civilizations have had to do this. And this is the situation that a future president is going to have to find himself in, because it's going to be chaos. And it'll only get worse. As Toynbee says, time is on the side of the barbarians. So once you remove that wall, you're in big trouble.
God, my mind is going in a lot of different directions right now. I mean, first of all, yes, on the subject of the barbarity of drug cartels, obviously you can cherry pick the worst examples, which is what I'm doing right now. But there are many horrible examples of how they treat their mainly rival cartels. And that's what most of the violence, most of the homicide in Latin America is, kind of similar to the United States, rival drug gangs, but on a much larger scale. But yes, there are accounts of drug cartels just lining up 20 members of a rival gang and just chainsawing their heads off one by one.
No, doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, there are reports of cartels drawing and quartering people with motorcycles. It's the deepest depths of human depravity. One interesting question is Mexico at this point more part of North America or more part of Latin America? Now, I think you and I would both probably answer Latin America, obviously, because culture matters more than economics. But from a purely economic point of view, Mexico is definitely more part of North America than it is part of Latin America. It's much more intertwined with the U.S. economy than it is with any Southern economies, and trades much more with the United States than it does with any other country, whereas actually the number one recipient of exports in the major South American countries is China. One other thing I'll say is on the drug war and drug policy in Latin America, the basic issue here is that various drugs are illegal in the United States. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, magic mushrooms, MDMA. Yeah, fentanyl, that's the biggest one, opioids. With fentanyl, and marijuana is somewhat illegal still.
It's vaguely illegal.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, federal law conflicts with state law in over 1/3 of U.S. states, but I think the informal arrangement is that the federal government does not enforce the law in states that have legalized marijuana for medical and recreational use. But what I was going to say is that the U.S. is this economic behemoth. About a quarter of the drug users in the world are in the United States. I mean, for some drugs, it's more than a quarter. For some drugs, it's less than a quarter. I'm guessing it averages out to about a quarter. But for example, I think like 1/3 of cocaine users in the world are American. So anyway, there's this unbelievably powerful economic force, the United States, with a lot of demand for drugs that are illegal in the United States. And they can't be supplied by U.S. companies because U.S. companies live in a country where the state is powerful enough to prevent them from engaging in illicit traffic on a large scale. So we have petty drug gangs, and they do kill each other in the United States. But then in Latin America, where you have much weaker states, you get these unbelievably strong drug cartels that in some cases, they have so much money that they're capable of systematically corrupting the state of the country they live in, and even going to war somewhat effectively with the state when the state begins to try to dismantle them. The one way in which I would push back against what you said is that I would not say Mexico is a failed state or that it has been completely overrun by drug cartels. I mean, I think that has been truer of certain other countries in the past. Actually, it may be true to some extent of Venezuela in the last few years. But in Mexico, it's more of a peripheral phenomenon. Large regions of the country are relatively safe and don't have much drug trafficking going on. But then you have other parts of the country where drug cartels really are the de facto power. So some people like to say that Mexico is a failed state, and I would not go that far. All right. So, okay, one other kind of random question related to ancestor mimesis in China. We've talked in the past about how crossing the mimesis threshold from imitating the dead ancestors and often burying them under the home you live in and having shrines to them in your home, et cetera, going from that to a more death accepting, or I suppose death denying, but in any case, a less ancestor mimetic society in which you both literally and figuratively place the dead outside, that is very important for making a civilization go from static to dynamic, from uninnovative to innovative, and really driving civilization forward. This is a point that Toynbee makes in his one-volume abridged version. I think it's a view that you're very sympathetic to. So the question I have is, and this is probably a huge question, and I don't want to spend an hour talking about it. It may be something that we just flag here for future discussion, but what explains the fact that China, which is a very ancestor mimetic culture to this day, nevertheless attained to high civilization?
because in the case of China, it's an extraordinarily complex civilization. But so one of the factors that you can see with it is a wrestle. I agree that it's a back and forth thing with the conservatism of the cults of the dead on the one hand, and the Chinese penchant for occasional, at least, innovation on the other, is that with China and the cults of the dead, they do separate out their cemeteries, like the West does during their Neolithic Yangshao period, where you have all the Yangshao farmers, and they start having cemeteries at the edges of the village instead of closer in. They do start the process of separation. But of course, in China, they never totally get rid of the cult of the dead. In fact, what they do is sublimate it into their temples of filial piety. The temples, every city has a temple of ancestral worship within the city itself, where you go in and you see these rows of tablets, and each tablet represents the soul of a dead ancestor, and you make offerings to it. You might burn incense, make offerings. And the cosmology too, there is the unification of with the Chinese microcosmology of the soul. There's two souls, a Hun soul and a Po soul. And the the Po soul goes up and the Hun soul goes down. And so they have to be brought back together in that worship of the dead ancestors. So they do retain it. Again, kind of like an organelle within the larger structure of the cellular organism. It performs a more specialized function rather than just governing the whole society entirely. Because once it becomes civilized, and it becomes civilized due to the exportation and diffusion of civilization from Mesopotamia across the steppe into India, then eventually into China. But the thing is, though, the development of Chinese civilization is so slow and gradual, it's almost a trickle. It can theoretically be pushed back to 2000 BC with the so-called early Dou culture, which some scholars think is probably the actual physical correlate for the Xia dynasty, XIA, the Xia dynasty, which was legendarily supposed to have preceded the Shang dynasty, which is 1500 BC. It sort of looks like it because they already have bronzes that are up and running. And this will become relevant in our discussion of Mesoamerica. They are already laying out turquoise mosaics of animal faces on the ground. Turquoise mosaics of faces of tigers and dragons and so forth on the ground, something the Olmecs continue with. They do have the bronze vessels, but they're not ornamented with iconography yet. They're really plain and bland looking, basically a culture of farmers that happens to know how to work bronze. But all the way down to 500 BC, the farming implements are basically Neolithic. You get it's a paradox. You get this high civilization with Shang dynasty that has writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, beautiful Shang dynasty vessels, which now are bronze, and they do have beautiful ornamentation all over them. But all the way down to 500 BC, there's nothing really in terms of technological transformation of farming implements or anything really. Then suddenly you hit 500 BC, and there's a major transformation that happens almost overnight. Where they start having ironworking starts coming in, the plow comes in, irrigation comes in, which astonishingly has been missing up to this point. Amazing to try to explain that sudden creative explosion in 500 BC. And I think the way you have to explain it is all the internecine strife that took place during the period of the contending states in 700.
The warring states, yeah.
Yeah, the warring states, the whole fabric of Chinese society disintegrates. And you get all these arrogant, haughty princes who don't have respect for the emperor and emperor worship. And the whole thing is splintering apart. And so they don't have respect for the cults of filial piety anymore, which is why it became necessary to produce Confucius. So Confucius, 500 BC, and he and Lao Tzu are part of the 100 schools, most of which we've lost due to the burning of the books. But Confucius's whole point in the Analects is that the cult of filial piety needs to be restored and upheld because it's the thing that holds civilization up. Sacrifices to the gods, worship of the ancestors, filial piety, even though he doesn't believe in the gods anymore.
Right.
But nonetheless, and he's right about this, the rites themselves, performing them, will uphold the society. So this is why I think, because the cult of the ancestors was so weakened by 500 BC, that it sort of allowed for an opening, a door was open to now an influx of technological innovation. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So really it's like the two sides of the mimesis threshold are maybe one of the main dialectics in Chinese civilizational history, right? To a much greater extent than Western civilization, they have this strong pull back toward the ancestors, personified by someone like Confucius, but it's just part of their culture to this day. It's not the extent of it, though. They also have a history of leaving that behind, not taking it seriously, plowing forward, and there's just more of a dialectic in China than there is in Western civilization. Do you think that generally?
Yeah, and there is always this sort of reluctance where the Chinese will introduce innovations, and then they'll turn around and say, "Oh, never mind." Kind of like the voyages in the 16th century of Zheng He. He's got all these maps and he's doing all these voyages, then comes back and a new emperor has come in that is now one of the conservative types. And he says, these voyages never existed. And he makes them burn all the maps. This never happened. That's the burning of the books, the same thing. All this philosophy never happened. That's the sting of conscience of the ancestors. Chinese civilization has had this oscillation all along, all the way through.
Yeah. An interesting question becomes, is this really different from what you see in any society? Because, of course, there's always a tension between progressive and conservatism, right? Or between radical and reactionary.
There usually is an emphasis, one way or the other. There's usually, Russia has this same pendulation I noticed recently between czars who will come in and be reformers, that will be followed by czars who are conservative reactionaries. The Metropolitan Nikon, the reformations that he, in conjunction with Tsar Alexei, introduced cause a schism in the Orthodox Church, whereby you have the reformers and then you have what's called the old believers, of whom Alexander Dugin regards himself as an alliance with Putin's primary architect. And they're the reactionaries, the conservatives. They want to keep the old ways. And so the old believers have been around. So there's been this fundamental schism, kind of like in the West with Protestants and Catholics. There has been a schism in the Orthodox Church ever since Alexei's reforms. So too, though, in the 19th century, you get, reforms there back and forth with, Nicholas II being regarded as Russia's policeman. He's this very conservative individual. And then you have Alexander II, but just before him, coming in and signing the Emancipation Manifesto and liberating all the serfs. And it causes all these structural problems in the Russian economy that produces anarchists that come in. And the whole thing begins to get very chaotic, this back and forth between reformers and reactionaries. So Russia has kind of that same back and forth as well. It's less evident in the West. We do have the Roman bipartisan political system of the patricians on the one hand and the plebeians on the other, that represent the left and the right there too as well. But it's not quite as pronounced as the extremes that both Russia and China seem to go to when they pendulate.
When we started out, I think in the first episode, I said we have these three big questions, which are like, what is the nature of civilization? What do all civilizations have in common? What's the pattern? What are the patterns we can discern? Blah, blah, blah. And then how do they differ across space and how have they changed over time? It occurs to me now that a push and pull, a conflict or a dialectic between reform and progress on the one hand and conservatism and reaction on the other is probably a societal or a civilizational universal, obviously. I mean, there are many ways to think about the left-right spectrum. It can mean different things, right? But one very important thing it means is the left is more about reform and progress, and the right is more about tradition and conservatism and viewing new ideas about progress skeptically because, what if things change in ways that are negative? Okay, so obviously that exists to some extent in the West. It even exists within the Catholic Church famously. More traditional Catholics versus more progressive Catholics. That's like a very big debate in the Catholic Church today. So clearly this dialectic exists in any civilization. That almost makes it more interesting to think about what makes China different. Maybe in the West, that progressive reformist pole is a little stronger and the conservative reactionary pole is a little weaker, whereas in China, maybe it's the other way around. So you've got the dialectic, but maybe they're just weighted a little differently. Maybe.
We can also think of Akhenaten too as, rebelling against the conservative Theban priesthood with this new religion that's almost basically aniconic, trying to get rid of all the funerary deities. And it's a huge collective trauma for that civilization. And then they respond by, after he's dead, anathematizing him from the records, getting rid of him. The Chinese did a similar thing with the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who comes in about 220 BC, where he comes in and he has scorn for the cults of the ancestors. He gets rid of all that. These are barbarians that have come in from the hinterlands and then conquer China and take over the cultural forms. And he institutes all these reforms, a new mode of currency, new zoning laws for different kinds of architecture, new weights and measures, all new standard for a type of writing. And that many reforms in such a conservative civilization as China would have to have been totally stressful for most people, a huge trauma. And indeed, as with Akhenaten, we see in subsequent generations a lot of vilification of Shi Huangdi. There is a text that I remember reading a biography of Qin Shi Huangdi. There's a text of a guy writing of him as this sort of giant Godzilla figure, stepping on all these villages and towns as this monstrosity. There was a swing there too. But always with China, it goes to these insane extremes with the book burnings and Shi Huangdi's massive, relentless reforms. It really does go to extremes, and it's really loud and visible, this back and forth pendulation with them. We just invented all these things. Now we're tossing them all out. Not many civilizations do that. They don't go quite that far. They usually retain their inventions.
So I think what I'm about to ask you is useful for anyone who's really trying to understand what makes something a civilization rather than two different civilizations. Toynbee distinguishes between Mayan and Aztec civilization. Spengler does not. He just has Mesoamerican. I think most historians of the region, it's not that they don't distinguish between Mayan and Aztec, but there is such a thing as Mesoamerican history with a pre-classic, classic, and post-classic periodization. And it encompasses the Olmecs in southern Mexico, the Mayans who are more in Guatemala, and then the Aztecs who are in central Mexico. But, historians treat it sort of as a block, Mesoamerican history. So Toynbee distinguishes Mayan and Aztec civilization. Mayan and Aztec are two of Toynbee's 20 or 30 civilizations. Spengler does not. I think you do not. I think arguably most historians do not. And I was just thinking to myself, why do we consider Greece and Rome part of the same civilization? Because Toynbee does not distinguish Greek and Roman, civilization. He just has Hellenic, I think he calls it. And that's universal. I mean, Spengler has Apollonian. We all talk about classical civilization. I think, in fact, you've said, in your view, Greece is to Rome as the Mayans are to the Aztecs, right? And maybe the Mycenaeans are to Greece as maybe the Olmecs are to the Mayans or something like that, right? But in any case, I just started to think about, why do we consider Greece and Rome part of this same civilization? And someone like Toynbee doesn't consider the Mayans and the Aztecs part of the civilization. What exactly does the relation between peoples have to be in order for them to be considered part of the same civilization? The last thing I'll say here before you run with it is, I know in very broad terms that Rome borrowed a great deal from Greece in terms of its myth, in terms of its art, in terms of its philosophy. Obviously, they were different languages, but the Romans were crazy for all things Hellenic, at certain periods in the history of their empire. So I don't know if geographical proximity combined with a really high degree of cultural influence is what makes Greece part of the same civilization as Rome. But if it is, then I would expect you to think that the Mayans were, in addition to being geographically proximate to the Aztecs, very influential on Aztec myth, art, etc. And the one thing I thought of here is that one characteristic of the Mayans and the Aztecs are these step pyramids. That's one really big similarity, striking similarity between the two cultures. Of course, it's something they share in common with the second oldest civilization of all time, Egyptian civilization, before they smoothed them out. But anyway, do you at least get what I'm trying to get at here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think one of the reasons that Toynbee does not separate Greece from Rome as two different societies is simply because in the West, they've always been revered as a unit. You've got Charlemagne in 800 evoking the Roman Empire, trying to bring it back, the ghost of the Roman Empire. You've got during the Renaissance, the Italians evoking the Greeks, trying to bring them back. And I think there's just a tradition in the West of revering classical antiquity as a whole, as a single unit, because as you say, the Romans did basically import and share Greek culture forms, same type of architecture, only on a larger scale. They're better at engineering feats like aqueducts and the Colosseum, big structures like that. And their philosophers are all emulating the Greeks. Their playwrights, the first playwrights that appear are copying Greek models and so forth. So, and the gods are the same, the characters are the same, the heroes are the same from, from Homer down to the plays of Seneca. Seneca is still writing about Oedipus Rex and Phaedra, just as Aeschylus was and Sophocles were doing. So it is pretty much, it's very clear that it's a single civilization with an early phase and a late phase.
I don't even know what this means exactly, but when I was growing up and consuming cartoon Greek mythology, which I loved, I learned at the time that these are the Greek names of the gods, but there's a Roman name for every one of these gods. Poseidon is Neptune, right. Zeus is Jupiter, right? So, yeah.
No, it's exactly the same with the Aztecs and the Maya in that respect. Same gods.
Oh, interesting.
Names, exactly the same. So now the question then comes, so why does Toynbee divide these up? And I reread his chapter the other day. He really makes a mess out of this. I think it's the worst thing pretty much that he's done with regard to societies, because he's actually talking about 4 or 5 different societies here. He first starts talking about, he doesn't mention the Olmecs, but he starts talking about, so the Mayan civilization goes from the highland Pacific coast Mayans. So you get them coming in around 600 BC or so, thereabouts. That's still in the pre-classic period, which we should say the pre-classic period corresponding to Spengler's model, not the anthropologist model, which is a little different. The anthropologists have pre-classic 2000 BC down to 250 AD. And I think, though, that the period before 1200 BC, before the Olmecs, is pretty much complete. It's Neolithic. It's not part of the pre-cultural period that Spengler would say pre-cultural, where you start getting actual culture forms coming in that you can see are pregnant with the later period. And that starts with the Olmec, 1200 BC. And then so with the Maya, though, so they move and they come in after the Olmec, still at the tail end of the pre-classics, 600-ish down to 200 AD, coming out from the mountains, the highland cities like Kaminalhuyu, then down onto the lowlands, almost like water flowing down off the mountains, moving up to the north. So you have the southern lowlands, and then the Yucatec Peninsula. And so Mayan history undergoes these 3 phases as it moves from one to the next, historically and chronologically, all the way down to 900 AD, which is the apocalypse for the southern lowlands, which is the great period. This is the southern lowland period of the cities of Tikal and Calakmul, who are constantly fighting each other, like Athens and Sparta, in Mesopotamia, like Umma and Lagash, in the west, like France and Germany. That's the high period. It's the period of the Bastard. So this is the southern lowlands. Palenque comes in. This is the high period of this Mesoamerican civilization from, let's say, 250 AD down to the collapse 900 AD. So when the collapse comes in 900 AD, Toynbee demarcates a line and he says, that's the first classic phase of the Maya, from that late pre-classic down to on the mountain highlands down to the southern lowlands. Then there's a collapse that still nobody has successfully explained why all these cities are suddenly abandoned and wiped out about 900. But then after that, the post-classic begins, and it shifts further to the coastal zone where we have Chichen Itza and Uxmal, what Spengler calls in his couple of pages on this. This is the Hellenistic period now. Chichen Itza and Uxmal are extremely cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, lots of languages are going on there. Not exactly atheistic, of course, that doesn't happen in a civilization like this, but nonetheless cosmopolitan world cities. They don't last very long, though. By 1100, 1200, and we're fully from 900 in the post-classic period, then it moves to the north to Mexico with the Toltecs in Tula. And the Toltecs they're sort of already neo-Roman in a certain sense. Their art is kind of stiff and militaristic. It's not very graceful. They don't last very long, couple of centuries. And then 1325, along come the Aztecs, who are these barbarians who come down from the hinterlands in the north. And they envy both the Toltecs on the one hand and the ancient city of Teotihuacan which comes way back to 200 AD. And its Great Pyramid of the Sun corresponds to our Gothic cathedrals. So that would be the springtime in the north, while the springtime was going on in the highlands, the Mayan highlands in the south. It's dead. It's 25 miles north of Tenochtitlan, and the Aztecs emulate it. They kind of like the Romans emulating the Greeks. They want to do a city that's worthy of it. So on Lake Texcoco, they build the Venice of this civilization, which is also the Rome of this civilization. It's this incredible engineering feat of building a city on a lake and getting it to float, because it's built on an island that's sinking. So they have to go through and put all these poles, wooden stakes stuck way down the whole island, so that when they put these huge city structures on top of it, the city won't sink. They did have constant trouble with flooding and subsidence and so forth. So it was a constant struggle for them. So that's 1325. And then they are conquerors. They have a triple alliance. Them, two other city states, they have to get rid of a competitor, which they do. And it's a triple alliance, just like a triumvirate. They're successful. And then they start, once the city's up and running of Tenochtitlan, with its great pyramid with two temples at the top. One's the temple sacred to the rain god Tlaloc, and the other sacred to Tezcatlipoca, the jaguar god, the ancient Olmec jaguar god, who's come all the way down to Tezcatlipoca. And they also, the Olmec also pretty much have what looks like the first image of the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, called by the Mayans Kukulkan, the Aztecs Quetzalcoatl. So they have the same gods, different names, just like the Romans vis-a-vis the Greeks. And then they go on major campaigns of conquest all over Mexico. They just conquer the whole thing, build an empire out of it, so that by the time the Spaniards get there in 1519, they are just getting their universal state, their sort of version of Rome, Roman Empire up and running. They would have gone quite a few more centuries, I think, if the conquistadors hadn't come in and just lopped off their heads, like Spengler says. It was like riding on your horse past a sunflower with a sword and just chopping off the top of the sunflower. That's what happened to this civilization. But Toynbee just chops all this up and says, well, there's that first Mayan society that ends when it shifts to the lowlands in the classic period. Then we have the Yucatec society that comes after it. But then we also have what he calls the Mexic society, by which he means the Toltecs, because they are in Mexico. And then the Aztecs, and they're totally different. So he winds up simplifying this to the best of his ability, where he says, we have the Mexic society in the north and the Yucatec society in the south. Doesn't even mention the Olmecs. And it just doesn't work. There's too many parsing, too much analysis. This is one civilization. Same gods, same culture forms, whether in the north or the south. The Olmec originate in Tabasco and Veracruz, in the middle between them, in Central America, and radiate spheres of influence south as far as El Salvador and north as far as Mexico. So the Olmec have already laid a trading network because they're hungry for things like jade and obsidian from the highland mountains. So they're setting up this trade network, which already lays the foundations, 1200 BC to 600 BC, of a pan-Mesoamerican society, if you want to call it that. So it is one civilization, one culture.
Okay, there are a number of things I want to talk about. First of all, who built Teotihuacan? What do we call the people who built Teotihuacan? Maybe you already.
I don't think that argument has been resolved, because it was a multi-ethnic city. There were Zapotecs there, some other peoples, Nahuatl, Nahuas. I don't think that has been. I don't think it's one people. It was famously multi-ethnic.
Okay, so this is a very cool, the personal intersecting with our conversation. But after sophomore year, I took a year off college and I went to Mexico. And where did I end up but the city of Jalapa, which is in the state of Veracruz. In fact, it's the capital of the state of Veracruz. And Veracruz borders Tabasco. These are relatively poor states in southern Mexico. Northern Mexico is more developed. Southern Mexico is less developed. I went there because I knew it wouldn't be overrun with tourists, that it would be a good place for me to learn Spanish, and because a professor who knows my mom recommended it because he had taught at the University of Veracruz, which is located in Jalapa, for one semester and really liked it. Okay, so I went there and I lived there for a year for that reason. And when I was there, this is long before I had any interest in the things you and I are talking about. Although I did read a book when I was there and learning Spanish. So I read it in Spanish called The Minimal History of Mexico. And it did talk about, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican history, but, I didn't retain much of it. Anyway, the second most revered anthropological museum in Mexico is the Anthropological Museum in Jalapa. And that is where all of the Olmec treasures are contained. All of the large sculpted heads, for example. Yeah. And when you walk into the museum, on the wall it says, "Mexicans, stop. This is the root of your history, your birthplace and your altar. You will hear the silent voice of the most ancient culture of Mexico, maybe of the mother civilization of our continent. The Olmecs converted water into harvests, sun into calendar, stone into sculpture, cotton into fabrics, pilgrimages into commerce, mountains into thrones, jaguars into religion, and men into gods."
Nice.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay, so in your framework, you applying the Spenglerian framework would place the Olmecs in the pre-cultural phase, the Mayans in the cultural phase,
early and
the
late
Aztec,
culture, and then the Aztec civilization. Yeah.
Aztec civilization, universal state, to use Toynbee's model.
Right.
Why do you think of the Olmecs as the pre-culture for the Mayans rather than just a distinct civilization?
They do announce all of a sudden some basic motifs that are very important, that are consistent throughout the entire rest of Mesoamerican history, one of which is the cult of the were-jaguar. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So you got the cult of the were-jaguar, and you have the earliest appearance of the basic layout of the north to south axis. Pretty much all, I didn't see an exception, except a bit for Tenochtitlan, because it has to be more in the shape of a square just because of the water and so forth. The north to south layout, that's standard for all of these cities. And it looks like the first appearance, not only of the jaguar god, which goes all the way down to the Aztec Tezcatlipoca, but also the feathered serpent. We find the earliest depiction of a guy that looks like he's riding on a serpent that has wings sprouting from its ears, which is Quetzalcoatl, Mayan Kukulkan. So we've got basic culture forms that are laid out and announced here already. Now, you asked about, also too here, you asked about if Spengler ever gave an Ur-Symbol for this culture, and he did not. But I think I can provide it. It's a ubiquitous image. It's there from day one with the Olmecs all the way down to the Aztecs. But here's what I think the Ur-Symbol is of this civilization. If you think of, let's say, take probably the most familiar might be like an Aztec eagle warrior. So you look at the Aztec eagle warrior, and he's wearing a headdress that is the jaws of the open beak of an eagle with a human head sticking out. That's the Ur-Symbol right there. That's its final appearance amongst the Aztecs. But all the way through the entire civilization, anyone who is anyone, that is anyone in the aristocracy, anyone, who's anyone, is always depicted with a headdress, jaws of a beast, wide open, human head peering out. That's the Ur-Symbol. And it appears here with the Olmec right at the very beginning. And it's fundamental because it indicates that the human being has been swallowed up by the belly of the beast. In other words, that the human ego has, in a certain sense, maybe you could put it this way, regressed back to the level of the astral plane and been swallowed up by astral forces. And this civilization remains that way all the way down the line. So you see that image of the character. You might be able to find this if you do an image search to illustrate the video here of the character, the Olmec figure, riding on a feathered serpent. And he's got a pouch of copan, which is incense, fragrance pleasing to the gods. And he's got the jaws of a were-jaguar as his headdress, a jaguar. And so where did that come from then? And so it came from the Chinese figure of what's called the Jiaojia. And the Jiaojia is a creature that's depicted in Chinese art pretty much as usually the tiger. And so the tiger, when it hops across the water, becomes the jaguar for the same reason that there are no tigers. So you have to substitute the nearest semiotic equivalent. Just as in Polynesian myth, think of the girl with the eel. There are no snakes, so you have to plug the eel into the semiotic vacancy that used to be the snake. Same thing here. The dragon becomes the feathered serpent. So the tiger and the dragon The dragon is the cosmic heaven symbol. It's masculine, it's yang. The jaguar or a tiger is the earth symbol, just as jaguar is an earth symbol, which is yin, it's female. Same valency, same semiotics. And so you see this character in Chinese art that appears with a tiger creature with jaws open and a human that it's about to eat and devour. So the Chinese, in turn, have inherited this from India. In India, it first appears there as what's called the Kirtimukha. And the myth of the Kirtimukha is that Shiva, it's a creature born from Shiva when a character comes in and says, I want your daughter. And Shiva is upset about this, and he shoots out a thunderbolt that creates this lion creature. So we move from lion to tiger to jaguar, this lion creature that's so hungry that Shiva tells it to eat itself. So it just devours its whole body until there's nothing left but a head. And so that head is put as like a Gorgon mask, an apotropaic mask at the lintel to every Shiva temple to ward off evil spirits. So it's apotropaic. But it's very clear that the Kirtimukha becomes the Gaodia on Chinese art, which then I'm convinced crosses the water to become the Mesoamerican Ur-Symbol of the belly of the beast with a human that's been swallowed up inside it, mostly due to human sacrifice. We're feeding these gods are humans, and it's making them happy. Because the other thing about this, too, is that the gasoline that powered Mesoamerican civilization was blood. And the reason for that is as follows, which is namely that after the 4 world ages took place, there are these 4 world ages. Each one ends with an apocalypse that corresponds to one of the first elements. And then it gets to the 5th age, and there's the god Quetzalcoatl. And humans haven't been created yet. So he descends down into the underworld, what's called Mictlan, or also variously known as Xibalba. He goes down to the god of the dead, Mictlan, and he grabs these bones, human bones, grabs them, brings them back up, and he offers them to the rattlesnake goddess, Coatlicue, who is a very close analog to the Indian Kali. She's a very dark figure, very bloodthirsty. She wears a necklace of human hands. And he offers these to her. She molds them into a kind of paste, and then he slices open his penis and bleeds blood into that to animate it, and she makes the first humans. So blood has to be returned for that primordial sacrifice. We call the myth of the sacrifice. So you're constantly having to feed blood to the gods to make anything happen whatsoever. Not only human sacrifice, but also the practice of cutting yourself. So what they'll do is they'll cut their tongues, or they'll cut their ears or their penises to offer blood to the gods. So when you do that, and there's a beautiful relief from the high period of Mayan art called Lady Jacques from the site of Yaxchilan. If you find that image, it would be great, because what's going on in there is that she has pierced her tongue and she's pulling a rope with needles on it through her tongue, pulling it through in order to conjure up the ancestors in the form of what's called a vision serpent, which is coming out of the fire in front of her. So you see this vision serpent, and then it's opening its mouth, and out springs a dead ancestor saying, like a genie in a bottle, what can I do for you? That's what the basic blood. This is a bloodthirsty civilization. And, they have to offer up human hearts to the sun god to keep the sun going. So in order to do that, you're constantly having to go conquer other tribes, other villages, other towns to bring back captives, so you can use an obsidian blade to chop open their chests and pull out the heart and offer it to the sun god. And the famous Aztec calendar, that's very famous, shows this perfectly with the sun god in the center, with a tongue hanging out that's in the shape of an obsidian blade that's used to to cut out the heart, and then 4 boxes around him, which represent the 4 world ages, and he represents the 5th. And so that's the primary Ur-Symbol for this civilization, and I believe that it came from China. It's a transformation to Chinese.
It's not that Spengler figures out that, okay, this block constitutes a civilization of its own, and then goes out in search of the Ur-Symbol. His methodology is more to look for a common Ur-Symbol. And then once he figures out what it is, see what its extension is. So I think It's not that you concluded by some other method that Olmec, Maya, and Aztec are all part of the same thing. Instead, you actually genuinely asked yourself that question and then noted these semiotic similarities between the three. And that's why Byzantine for him is Magian, right?
Because the cavern world is cavern. What Kant called, it confers synthetic unity on the manifold of differences. It pulls it all together with one hidden symbol that's implicit behind all the sensory phenomena that are manifest of that symbol.
And because Toynbee is less centrally focused on these things or less attuned to them or has less of an eye for them, he focuses more on politics and geography.
Politics and geography, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's why, especially maybe in the regions he doesn't know as much about which there's less historical research, just the number of societies and civilizations proliferates.
It's funny that you asked me that question because I never even asked myself that question. What's the Ur-Symbol for this civilization? So I'm glad you asked it. It took me some time to sort of chew on it a bit for a few days until I came up with it.
I wanted to add, though, that your view that Chinese civilization diffused to Mesoamerican civilization and influenced it, first of all, we should note it's not universally accepted, but you would furnish numerous pieces of evidence.
The Chinese also laid out their cities on a north-south axis. If you look at a topographical map of Beijing, you'll see that central axis going right through the city, north-south. Plus, the north for them is the sinister direction. It's where the underworld is located. So the Chinese have, traditional Chinese, I'm sure not modern Chinese, build their houses facing south. So wayward spirits don't blow in through your doorway coming down from the north. And it does seem to be that in Mesoamerican society, they have the city on a north-south axis. I don't know about the custom of building the houses facing south, though. But the north is the sinister direction. It's associated with the colors black and red. Red for blood and black, of course, for the underworld. So there's that. There's a whole bunch of other similarities in motifs, such as, for example, I mentioned those Shah Dynasty turquoise animal mosaics. That turns up on the ground, turns up amongst the Olmecs with animal face, jaguar face mosaics made out of serpentine, not turquoise, also laid on the ground. You would swear that it looks just like a Shah Dynasty animal turquoise, plus also the fact that they both revere jade, and they have a custom in both places of putting a jade bead into the mouth of the dead person, because it's thought amongst the Chinese that jade confers immortality on a person. It's a hell of a coincidence that the Olmecs would do exactly the same thing, which later evolves, of course, into the jade mask. They lay an entire jade mask, or they'll put jade balls into either one of the hands of the dead ruler. So there's all that. Then we have this interesting thing about the hieroglyphs. So there's a little collection of miniature figures. There's like 12 or 13 of them. They're like 6 inches tall each, gathered sort of around in a circle with 6 jade celts surrounding them like a half moon. And on those jade celts, back in the 90s, a Beijing Shang Dynasty expert was invited to take a look at them because a couple of them have mysterious writings on the side of them. And so he came and he looked at them and he said, yes, I can read this. These are Shang Dynasty hieroglyphs. It says, in this period was founded a new kingdom here. That's what it says. That was an article that appeared in Newsweek called A Tale of Two Cultures, if you look it up. In the 90s. So just seemed like a random thing. It wasn't a scholarly article or anything. But then this guy came across his article on JSTOR, the academic site, the other day, written by a guy named Mike Xu, XU. Mike Xu from 2002 said, he didn't even make reference to that event. He just said, the title of the article is something like further evidence for Transpacific diffusion. And then what he does is he goes in and analyzes those jade celts. Instead of one of them, it's 2 or 3 of them. And he shows you, he lines up one column showing the Olmec hieroglyph. Then he shows you the comparison with the Shang Dynasty hieroglyph. Then he shows you the comparison with the later Chinese Shang Dynasty image. And then finally, the English translation. So as you're looking at the Shang Dynasty hieroglyphs, they're pretty much exact. The Olmec hieroglyphs and the Shang Dynasty hieroglyphs resemble each other way more than the Shang Dynasty hieroglyphs do the later Chinese hieroglyphs, way more. And they're pretty much exact if you look at them and read this paper. That's startling evidence to me that cannot be a coincidence or a mistake of perception for it to be that precise and exact. So somehow, and there are currents too, that go across the Pacific that will take you naturally from Kyushu in Japan. It'll take you right down to Ecuador. Even if you just did nothing, the currents will take you there. So the currents move from west to east. They're entirely favorable to Transpacific diffusion. So
Fascinating.
like something politically happened with the Shang dynasty, which existed from 1500 BC to 1000, and the Olmec is right in the middle there with 1200. Something happened there politically, maybe that involved some refugees, some discontents who have seceded from the body social, who were part of the creative elite somehow, and there was discontent. Maybe they got into a few boats, followed the currents, and migrated south to the New World, to Central America. There's one current that will go from China to San Francisco, or no, I take that back, from just about Tokyo to San Francisco. Then you can hop on it again, and it'll take you down to Ecuador. And then we also have to consider the fact, too, that the earliest pottery in the New World is Japanese pottery found in Ecuador, 3000 BC, Jomon pottery from Japan. How the fuck did that get there? Then again, 1,000 years later, 2000 BC, there's another wave of Japanese pottery that appears on the shores of Ecuador. Gee, I wonder how that got there. But it wasn't a one-time event, because there's a long history going all the way down to Han Dynasty China, 200 AD, after which China drops out, and then it shifts to Southeast Asia and Angkor Wat, which was a Hindu colonial outpost that then begins interacting with the Mayans in their high period. And I think it's interesting that here's another, I think, evidence for diffusion, that the Mayans have the number 0, and it's claimed by American anthropologists that they invented it. However, in the old world, 0 was invented by the Hindus. And so I have a very strong feeling that it may have migrated via that Southeast Asian civilization of Angkor Wat into the New World, because it doesn't appear till relatively later on amongst the Maya, and it helped them figure out their very complex calendar. So American anthropologists have this emotional rejection to all of this, because they resent the implication that the New World could not have come up with high civilization on their own. The only problem with that argument is that no civilization has ever come into being on its own. None of them, not one. They all are the result of dialogues with other civilizations. Even Sumer, which was in dialogue with all the Neolithic societies coming before it. None of them came into being out of a vacuum. So why would Mesoamerica be the first? They're not the first. It's a bias. It's an emotional bias, and it totally ignores the fact that influence doesn't mean that it takes away your originality any more than I've been influenced by the work of William Irwin Thompson or Joseph Campbell or Oswald Spengler, and suddenly I don't have any originality about me. That's ridiculous.
Almost everything original comes from two things like crashing into each other, right? Or
and creators that absorb influences, maybe pseudomorphically, and then transform them into something new, which is what Mesoamerica did. It made these civilizational influences their own and turned it into a totally unique civilization.
Although, and maybe we can end here, it would be one thing if we just found scattered evidence of these things, but they hadn't really made their way into Mesoamerican culture. But that's not what we see. Instead, what we see is culture forms that come from the Far East actually deeply influence the development of Mesoamerican culture. And that's interesting, right? One wonders, how did that happen? Or how many people we're talking about. But, it's one thing to just show up on foreign shores and carry on as you were to the extent possible. It's another thing to insinuate yourself into a new civilization and really get mixed in with it at its embryonic stage and therefore influence its entire development. So do you have any thoughts on how that might have happened? Obviously, it's speculation, or maybe it's not. But again, the question is, how did these mainly Chinese people actually influence Mesoamerican culture so much rather than simply washing up on their shores and being a kind of alien civilization that just got repelled?
Well, in some cases, my suspicion with the Olmec is that and some of their statues do look like Chinese people. If you look at them, you can pull up one called the Wrestler. So there's a lot. And so that group of people may have been refugees that got shipwrecked or stranded or just landed there and said, that was a long crossing. Let's just camp out here. But in other cases, it might have been, people like Zheng He, where we do have a paradigm moving from China to the New World there that's more or less respected. So that's a precedent. So why not rewind backward? What were the other Zheng He voyages? From Angkor Wat, let's say, who may have been traders and have heard rumors. They follow the scent. They land there. They trade goods. But as everybody knows, like along the old Silk Road, which was open from Shanghai, China to Cadiz, Spain from 100 BC to 100 AD, commerce does not just involve the trade of shells and in the New World jade and obsidian. It brings ideas along with it. Religious and spiritual practices will be noticed as well. Oh, you guys do that? Well, we do this. Have you ever thought of this? And then the traders leave, and maybe they've left an impression on the natives, or they introduce them to some mathematical system that's alien to them, like the number 0, for instance. Maybe some of these exchanges are very casual. Maybe, as in the case of the Olmecs, they're not. They're refugees who camp out and decide to rebuild their own world. So it's difficult to know how it happened. We're just seeing the effects. The causes are difficult to fathom. But I think the effects they're pretty concrete. Some
probably historians said that traveling back in time slowly would be the greatest pleasure of which he could conceive. And I very much relate to that. Like if I could go forward or back, I'd be very torn, but I think I'd go back because I just want to see all of this stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I feel exactly the same. It's such a pleasure going back and finding out the causes of historical phenomena, why the world is the way it is now.
And also seeing some of these events like Christ's crucifixion that have become. But I know that you're not an antiquarian, you're not an archaist, you're very future oriented as well. Like you like sci-fi more than fantasy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So for you, it seems like it would be hard to decide whether you wanted to go forward or back. If you
it would. I might choose the future, actually, in my case.
I might too, because there's an asymmetry, right? There's a lot we do know about the past. Obviously, much more we don't know, but there is a lot we do know. There's nothing we know about the future.
Right. Yeah. That's the bigger mystery. Yeah,
I'd like exactly.
To more about that. And then I'd come back here and tell people about it, and then they would crucify me, being a heretic. And then the cycle just perpetuates itself.